Hello everyone, this is a story about how rope was made before modern machines. Feel free to subscribe to my channel so you can hear from me again. Before we begin, just settle in, let your shoulders rest. Take a slow, easy breath. There is nothing you need to solve tonight, just listen. Somewhere, in an old yard beside a river, there is a coil of rope lying on a wooden floor. It is not new. The surface has darkened with handling. Dust has settled in the little grooves. One end is frayed, and where it is frayed, you can see what rope really is. Not one thing, many things, held together. A rope looks simple from a distance. A line, a length, something used to tie, lift, pull, fasten, drag, haul, lower, bind or hold. But when you come close and let your fingers follow it slowly, you begin to feel its structure. It is made of smaller cords. Those cords are made of yarns. Those yarns are made of fibers, and each fiber once belonged to a plant, or an animal, or a tough inner stem split and cleaned by hand. Before modern machines, rope began with this plain idea: many weak things can become one strong thing if they are drawn out, laid beside each other and twisted. A single hemp fiber is not much. It is pale, dry and slight. You could break it easily between your fingers. A handful of fibers is still loose and untidy. They catch on the skin. They bend and separate. But if the fibers are combed into the same direction and then twisted gently, they begin to grip one another. Their rough surfaces hold. Their length overlaps. The twist keeps them from slipping apart. That is the quiet cleverness of rope. Strength does not come from one perfect strand, it comes from thousands of small strands sharing the strain. Long before factories, people understood this with their hands. They understood it without needing a formula. They could feel when fiber was too short, too brittle, too damp, too dirty. They could feel when a yarn had been twisted too loosely and would open under load, or too tightly and would kink against itself. Rope making was a craft of tension, not violent tension, a steady, patient pull, enough to keep the fibers straight, enough to make them obedient, not enough to tear them. The materials changed from place to place. Hemp was valued for strong rope. Flax could be used for finer lines. In some regions, people used grasses, bark fibers, palm fibers, horsehair, or strips of hide. The principle remained the same. Find something long and fibrous, clean it, align it, twist it into yarn, twist the yarns together into strands. Before modern machines, rope was one of those ordinary things that quietly held the world together. It did not seem special. It was not usually praised. It was not carved with names, or kept in glass cases, or written about with much excitement, but it was everywhere. A length of rope might hang beside a well, darkened by water and by the touch of many hands. Another might be tied around a bundle of firewood, or looped through the handle of a bucket, or stretched across a cart to keep sacks of grain from shifting on a rough road. In a barn, rope held animals, lifted hay, fastened gates, and mended broken things until there was time to mend them properly. In a town, it raised awnings, secured shutters, lowered goods from upper windows, and tied packages for carrying. The reason rope was everywhere is simple. Human beings often need to pull, lift, bind, drag, hang, fasten, and hold. And for thousands of years before steel cables, plastic straps, electric hoists, and factory-made cord, the answer to many of those needs was a twisted line made from plant fiber. A rope is a tool, but it is also a kind of extension of the hand. With a rope, one person can pull something from a distance. Two people can share the weight of a load. A heavy object can be lifted upward instead of carried by the back. A boat can be tied to a post. A door can be held shut against the wind. A bundle can become one manageable thing instead of many loose things falling apart. This made rope useful in nearly every setting. On farms, it belonged to the daily rhythm of work. Tying sheaves, leading cattle, drawing water, securing tools, hanging meat, lifting baskets, and fastening loads before a journey. In workshops, it helped turn wheels, suspend weights, and keep materials in place. On building sites, ropes raised stone, timber, bricks, tiles, and baskets of lime. In mines, they lowered people and tools into dark shafts. In fishing villages, they held nets, boats, anchors, and drying frames. And at sea, rope became almost a world of its own. A sailing ship was in one sense a wooden body controlled by lines. Ropes lifted the sails, trimmed them to the wind, held the mast steady, hauled anchors, moved cargo, tied the ship to land, and kept order in a place where wind and water were always trying to take order away. Because rope was so common, people wore it out. They spliced it, tarred it, dried it, coiled it carefully, and saved the shorter pieces for smaller jobs. A good rope was not thrown away lightly. Even when it was too frayed for heavy work, it could still tie a gate, mend a fence, or bind a bundle in the corner of a shed. So before we look at how rope was made, it is worth noticing how much of ordinary life depended on it. Not loudly, not proudly, just there, hanging from a peg, lying in a coil, or stretched between two hands doing its work. Before a rope could be twisted, before anyone could walk backward down a rope walk, before the long cord could be coiled on a ship's deck or hung beside a well, there had to be fiber. That is where rope really begins, not with the finished line, but with plants growing in a field, quiet green stalks, standing close together, moving a little in the wind. To us, they might look like ordinary crops. To a rope maker, they were the beginning of strength. Hemp was one of the most important of these plants. For centuries, it was grown wherever strong rope was needed, especially in places that built ships, raised barns, kept horses, and hauled heavy loads. The useful part was not the soft leaf, and not the seed, though both had their uses. The useful part for rope was hidden in the stem. Long, tough fibers ran through it just beneath the outer skin, and those fibers could be separated, cleaned, combed, spun, and twisted into lines that would hold under strain. Flax was another old fiber plant. It is often remembered for linen, for shirts and sheets and household cloth, but it could also be made into cordage. Flax fibers were finer than hemp, smoother in the hand, and good for lighter lines, nets, thread, and bindings. Where hemp gave a rope a certain coarse strength, flax gave a cleaner, paler strand, useful in work that needed firmness without as much bulk. There were other fibers too, depending on where people lived. In some places, ropes were made from grasses, reeds, bark, rushes, palm fiber, coconut coir, animal hair, or strips of hide. People used what the land gave them. A rope made in a northern village might begin in a flax field. A rope made near the sea in a warmer country might begin with coconut husks soaked in water. A rope used by herders might contain horsehair twisted patiently into a useful cord. The important thing was length. A short, brittle fiber could be useful for stuffing or padding, but rope wanted long strands. Long fibers overlapped one another when twisted. They gripped together. Each single fiber was weak, almost nothing by itself, but many fibers laid beside one another, turned in the same direction, became something quite different. The twist made them cooperate. That is one of the quiet lessons of rope. Its strength is not in one perfect piece, it is in thousands of small pieces, all prepared, aligned, and persuaded to hold together. A bundle of raw hemp was not yet rope, it was stiff, woody, and rough. It still carried bits of stalk and dust and field smell. It had to be retted, dried, broken, scutched, hackled, and sorted before the rope maker could use it well. Each step took time. Each step removed what was not needed and preserved what was. So before the rope walk, before the turning hooks, before the long backward walk, there was this quieter work, choosing the right plant, waiting for... Before a rope could be twisted, before it could be stretched down the long floor of a rope walk, the fibers had to be prepared into something long enough, clean enough, and even enough to work with. This was quiet work, but it mattered very much. A rope is strong because many small things agree to pull together, but at the beginning those small things are loose and disorderly. Hemp stalks, flax stems, strips of bark, Animal hair, grasses, reeds, or whatever the place and season provided. They came from fields, marshes, riverbanks, forests, and sheds. They arrived as plants and scraps, not as rope. For hemp and flax, the first task was to separate the useful fiber from the woody stem. The stalks were often retted, which meant they were left to soften in water or laid out in damp fields until moisture and time loosened the bond between the outer fiber and the inner core. It was not a clean-smelling process. Retting ponds could have a sour, earthy smell, something between wet hay and old river mud, but it worked. The plant slowly gave up its tightness. After retting, the stalks were dried again. Then they were broken. A worker used a simple wooden brake, something like a hinged jaw, to crack the brittle inner stem into small pieces. The long fibers on the outside bent and survived. The woody bits inside snapped and fell away. Then came scutching. The worker held the bundle upright and beat or scraped it with a wooden blade, knocking away the broken sheaves that still clung to the fibers. Dust rose, small fragments scattered on the floor. The good fiber grew lighter in the hand, but it was still not ready. The fibers had to be combed. This was called hackling or heckling, depending on the place. The worker drew the bundle through rows of iron teeth fixed into a board, first through coarse teeth, then finer ones. The comb caught knots, tow, broken pieces, and short fibers. It pulled the long strands into order. This must have been a patient, repetitive sound. Fiber drawn through iron, a soft rasp, a pause, a shake of the hands. Then again, the longest fibers were saved for the best yarns because long fibers made smoother, stronger rope. Shorter fibers could still be used, but they needed more twist to hold together and the finished cord would be rougher. Nothing was wasted if it could be helped. The clean line fiber went one way, the tangled tow went another. At the end of this preparation, the worker held something that was still very humble, not thread yet, not rope, just a pale, fibrous bundle combed straight, dry, and ready. But already the future rope was inside it. The strength was not visible in one strand. One strand could be snapped easily between the fingers, but when hundreds of them were laid together, drawn out, twisted, and made to share the strain, they became something else. So the making of rope began not with force, but with sorting, cleaning, combing, straightening, teaching wild fiber to lie in one. Before a rope could become a rope, it first had to become yarn. That may sound like a small step, but it was one of the quietest and most important parts of the whole craft. A rope was not made directly from a handful of hemp or flax. It was built up slowly from many long fibers, drawn out, overlapped, and twisted until they held together as one continuous line. The person spinning the yarn began with dressed fiber. The rough woody parts had already been broken away. The fibers had been combed or heckled until they lay mostly in the same direction. They were still not perfectly even. Some strands were longer, some were shorter, some were pale and fine. Others were coarse, yellowish, or dark from the field and the drying shed. A small bundle might be tied to a distaff, or simply held under one arm. The spinner took a few fibers between the fingers and pulled them gently away from the mass. This pulling was called drafting. It had to be done with care. Too many fibers at once, and the yarn became thick and lumpy. Too few, and it became thin and weak. Then came the twist. Twist is what makes loose fibers behave like a thread. Each fiber is short compared with the length of the yarn, but when many fibers overlap, and all of them are turned together in the same direction, they grip one another. The roughness of the plant fiber helps. The slight unevenness helps. What was soft and drifting becomes firm enough to wind, carry, and later combine into rope. In many places this was done with a simple spindle. The spindle was not complicated. It was a slim stick, sometimes weighted with a small whorl, that could be set turning by hand. The spinner twisted it, let it hang, and watched as the turning motion traveled upward into the drafted fibers. A small length of yarn formed between the hand and the spindle, tightening as it turned. The hands had to know the pace. Pull too slowly and the twist made a hard, wiry thread. Pull too quickly and the fibers slipped apart before they were caught.
Good spinning was not only strength and not only patience, it was rhythm. Draw, twist, wind, draw, twist, wind, over and over until the spindle carried a little swelling cone of yarn. For rope making, the yarn did not need to be beautiful in the way fine linen thread might be beautiful. It did not need to be delicate. It needed to be steady, strong enough to take more twist later, even enough that weak places did not gather in one part of the finished rope, long enough to be useful in the rope walk where many yarns would eventually be stretched out side by side. A spinner could feel problems before seeing them. A thin place passed through the fingers differently, a lump resisted the twist, a rough knot of fiber made the line drag, so the work was corrected as it happened, not by measuring but by touch. This was the beginning of rope in its narrowest form, not yet a cord, not yet a line for a bucket or a sail.
The place where rope was made was often called a rope walk. The name is plain and very accurate. It was a place for walking. Not a room full of machines, at least not in the older form. Not a factory floor with belts and engines. Just a long, narrow stretch of ground, sometimes covered by a shed, sometimes open to the weather, where workers could walk backward and forward while the rope slowly came into being. A rope walk had to be long because rope itself was long. A short workshop could make short cord, but if you needed rope for a well or a cart or the rigging of a ship, the strands had to be stretched out for many yards. In some towns, the rope walk ran along the edge of a field, or behind houses, or beside a dockyard. It might be a covered lane with posts and hooks at one end and a turning wheel at the other. It was not grand, it was practical. A long path for long work. Imagine stepping into one in the morning. The air is cool, the ground is packed hard by years of feet. There is a smell of hemp fiber, dry dust, oil, and perhaps tar from older ropes stored nearby. Along the length of the walk, pale fibers hang in loose bundles, waiting to be drawn out. At one end, iron hooks turn slowly. At the other, a worker holds the strands and keeps them even, watching with his hands as much as with his eyes. The rope walk was a simple arrangement, but it required attention. The fibers or yarns were fastened to hooks. The hooks were turned, sometimes by a hand crank, sometimes by a wheel, sometimes by a boy walking in a circle. As the hooks turned, the yarns began to twist. Twist is what gives rope its strength. A loose fiber can pull apart. A twisted strand grips itself. Several twisted strands laid together in the opposite direction grip one another even more firmly. This balance mattered. Too little twist, and the rope was soft and weak. Too much twist, and it became hard, kinked, and unwilling to lie straight. The worker had to feel the right point between slackness and strain. He could see it in the way the yarn tightened. He could hear it in the faint creak of the fibers. He could feel it through the tension in his arms as he walked. Often there was a wooden tool called a top, shaped with grooves to guide the strands as they came together. The top moved slowly along the walk, keeping the strands separate until the right moment, then allowing them to close into one rope. Behind it, the finished line appeared, round and firm as if it had always been one thing. In front of it, separate yarns still stretched away, thin and unfinished. The work was patient. Step by step, turn by turn, the rope grew. A man might spend much of his day moving along the same narrow path, watching fibers become yarn and yarn become rope. The rope walk was not only a place, it was a rhythm. The turning of hooks, the backward walking, the sliding wooden top, the slow tightening of ordinary plant fiber into something that could lift a bucket, hold a sail, bind a load, or tie a gate close. In a rope walk, the work did not always look like making rope at first. Sometimes it looked like a person simply walking backward, very slowly, down a long, straight path. At one end of the walk there was a turning wheel, or a hook fixed to a crank. At the other end, far away, the worker held the loose fiber in his hands. Hemp, flax, or another prepared fiber lay over one arm, or was gathered at the waist, ready to be drawn out little by little. The path between the worker and the wheel might be open to the sky, or sheltered under a long wooden roof. It had to be long because rope needs distance. A short room makes a short line. A long walk makes a useful one. The worker began close to the spinning hook. A few fibers were fastened to it, and as the hook turned, the fibers began to twist together. This was not yet rope, it was yarn, a thin, rough, tightening line. The worker walked backward as the turning continued, feeding more fiber into the twist as he went. This was the quiet skill of it. He could not simply let the fiber run freely. If too much went in, the yarn became thick and lumpy. If too little went in, it became weak and thin. His fingers had to measure the fiber almost without thinking. They pinched, released, drew, and smoothed. The twist traveled along the length like a slow ripple. Behind his hands, the fibers closed into a line. In front of his hands, the loose bundle still looked soft and unfinished. The pace mattered. The turning wheel had its rhythm, and the walking body had to answer it. Too fast, and the yarn was underfed. Too slow, and the twist crowded up, making kinks and uneven hard places. A good spinner learned the distance by feel. He knew how much fiber to pull from the bundle. He knew when the line was tightening properly. He could sense it in the small resistance against his fingers. Imagine the sound of it, the faint rasp of dry fiber moving through the hand, the wooden wheel turning, footsteps on beaten earth, plank or worn stone. Perhaps another worker calling softly from farther down the walk. Perhaps the smell of hemp dust in the air, and tar somewhere nearby, and damp wood after rain. The worker kept moving backwards, step by careful step. He did not look dramatic, he did not hurry. The rope walk rewarded patience more than strength. What mattered was steadiness. The fibers had to be guided into agreement with one another. Each separate strand was weak by itself, but once twisted beside its neighbors it began to hold. By the time the worker reached the far end, there might be a long yarn stretching behind him, tight and living under the turn of the hook. It had been made by walking away from the machine, not toward it. A line created by retreat, a useful thing drawn out of loose fiber, one backward step at a time. And when that yarn was finished, it was not the end of the work. It was only one of the smaller lines that would later be gathered with others, twisted. Emotion calm. Once the yarn had been spun, the work was still only partly done. A single yarn of hemp or flax could be useful on its own, for sewing, binding, mending, or tying small things together, but it was not yet rope. It was still too thin, too easily worn, too likely to break under a real strain. Rope began when several yarns were brought together and made to share their strength. This was the quiet cleverness of the craft. One fiber was weak. Many fibers twisted into a yarn were stronger. Several yarns twisted together became stronger again. And several of those small cords twisted together in the opposite direction could become a rope thick enough to haul a cart, raise a bucket, hold a sail, or tie a boat to a post. The direction of the twist mattered. If the yarns had been spun one way, the next stage usually twisted them the other way. This balanced the rope. Without that balance, the strands would try to untwist themselves, curling and kinking like a restless living thing. A good rope did not fight the hand. It lay with a certain calmness. It bent, but it did not fall apart. It tightened under strain instead of loosening. In the rope walk, this work could take place along a long open floor, under a roof if the maker was fortunate, or outdoors if he was not. At one end, yarns were fastened to hooks. At the other, a worker held them apart with a wooden tool called a top, sometimes shaped like a rounded cone or a grooved block. The top kept the strands from tangling too soon. It guided them slowly and evenly as they came together. The hooks turned. Sometimes they were turned by hand with a crank, sometimes by a wheel, later by simple gearing. The yarns began to twist around one another. The worker with the top walked steadily backward or forward depending on the arrangement of the rope walk, letting the strands close behind the tool at just the right pace. Too fast, and the rope became hard, tight, and uneven. Too slow, and it remained loose and weak. The maker had to feel the difference. He watched the angle of the strands. He listened to the small dry whisper of fiber rubbing against fiber. He noticed whether the forming rope looked smooth or lumpy, whether one yarn was taking more strain than the others.
There was no screen to read, no gauge glowing with numbers. The measurement was in the eye, the wrist, and the long experience of repetition. A rope maker learned how much twist was enough by seeing what failed, what held, what sagged, and what tightened cleanly when pulled. And so the rope lengthened behind the moving top, inch by inch, yard by yard. What had been separate threads became one line, not by glue or nails or metal fittings, but by tension and turning, by the simple act of many small things leaning into one another, each holding the next in place.
For rope that was meant to stay indoors in a barn loft or a dry workshop, the making could end once the strands were twisted, stretched, and coiled. But much rope did not live in dry places. It went into wells, it crossed rivers, it lay on wet decks and damp ground, it passed through rain, mist, salt air, mud, and the slow changes of weather. And so, before modern synthetic fibers, people had to think carefully about what water would do to a rope. Plant fiber is strong, but it is also alive in a certain old sense. Hemp and flax came from stems that once drew water from the soil. Even after cutting, retting, drying, beating, and spinning, the fibers still responded to moisture. A dry rope could feel firm and light in the hand. A wet rope could grow heavy, stiff, and swollen. It could tighten around a post or a pulley. It could be harder to bend, harder to knot, harder to undo. If it stayed wet too long, it could begin to rot from the inside where air did not reach easily. This was one reason tar became so important. In a rope walk or in a yard nearby, ropes for ships and outdoor use might be treated with tar made from pine wood or other resinous material. The tar was dark, sticky, and strong smelling. It clung to the fibers and worked its way between the turns of the rope. Sometimes yarns were tarred before they were laid together. Sometimes finished rope was drawn through warm tar, handled carefully, and then hung or stretched out to dry. The aim was not to make the rope beautiful, it was to help it endure. Tar did several quiet jobs at once. It helped shed water, it slowed decay, it discouraged mildew and small living things that might feed on damp fiber. It also made the rope darker and stiffer. A new tarred rope could leave marks on hands and clothing. It could smell sharply of smoke, resin, and earth. On a ship, that smell mixed with salt, wet wood, canvas, bilge water, and the wind coming in from the sea. But tar was not magic. A rope still needed care. Sailors, farmers, well diggers, and workers of all kinds learned to keep rope off the wet ground when they could. They hung coils from pegs, they laid them over rails, they shook out loops so air could pass through. A rope put away wet and tight was a rope being slowly wasted. A rope dried in loose coils might serve again. Weather also changed the feel of rope from day to day. In dry heat a line might become rough and brittle. In rain it might grow heavy and drag against the hand. In frost it might stiffen into something almost wooden. The people who used rope learned these small changes without needing to name them. They felt them through their palms. So rope was never only fiber and twist, it was also weather, care, and time. It carried the mark of the place where it was used, the tar of the shipyard, the damp of the well, the dust of the farm, the salt of the harbor, and the patient hands that kept it from failing too soon. The well rope lived a harder life than many other ropes. It did not rest in a dry loft, coiled neatly on a peg. It worked every day in the damp air above stone and earth. It passed over a wooden roller or around a simple windlass. It carried the weight of a bucket, and then the greater weight of the water inside it. It was pulled by hands, by children, by servants, by farmers, by anyone who needed water before the fire could be lit, before bread could be mixed, before animals could be watered. For this kind of work, the rope had to be strong, but it also had to be familiar. People touched it constantly. They knew its roughness. They knew where the fibers had begun to fray. They knew the place where the bucket was tied on, and the part that always seemed to darken first from wet hands. A household might not think much about its well rope when it was new, but everyone noticed when it began to weaken. The maker of such a rope had to think about water from the beginning. Hemp was often valued because it made a strong line, but any natural fiber changed when it was soaked again and again. A rope that was always wet could swell, stiffen, and hold grit in its twist.
If it dried poorly, it could begin to rot from the inside where the damage could not be seen at first. So the strands had to be laid firmly enough to resist wear, but not so tight that the rope became hard and lifeless in the hand. The bucket end was especially important. A simple knot might serve for a time, but knots could tighten, slip, or chafe against the wooden handle. In many places, the rope was spliced around an iron ring or through the handle of the bucket, so the pull was shared more evenly. Splicing was slower than tying a knot. The strands had to be opened, tucked back into the body of the rope, and drawn tight in a neat pattern. But a good splice made the rope seem almost continuous, as though it had grown around the bucket itself. At the top of the well, the rope met wood, stone, and sometimes iron. Each lift rubbed the same portion of fiber over the same surface. If the well had a smooth roller, the rope lasted longer. If it scraped over a rough edge, it suffered. People learned to listen to the small signs: a dry creak from the windlass, a rasping sound where the rope crossed stone, a slight unevenness in the pull as the bucket rose from the dark below. In winter, a wet rope could be cold enough to sting the fingers. In summer, it could smell of damp hemp, mud, and the mineral coolness of the well. The bucket came up shining and heavy, swinging slightly, drops falling back into the shaft. The rope darkened where the water touched it, then lightened again as it dried in the morning air. It was an ordinary piece of equipment, but it belonged to the rhythm of the house, down into the quiet, up with the water, hand over hand, day after day, until the fibers softened, thinned, and finally had to be replaced with another line made from many smaller strands.
Of all the places where rope mattered, the ship may be the easiest to imagine. Not a modern ship with engines below and steel cables hidden inside its machinery, but a wooden sailing vessel lying at a wharf, its hull dark with pitch, its masts rising high above the deck, its sails furled and heavy, and lines everywhere. There were ropes along the rails, ropes hanging from pins, ropes coiled neatly on the planks, ropes leading upward into the rigging, disappearing among blocks and spars, then coming down again where a sailor could reach them. The ship was, in a way, a wooden machine held in motion by rope. Before modern engines, the wind was the power, but rope was what allowed people to use that power. A sail could catch the wind, but only if it could be raised, lowered, turned, tightened, and eased. Each of those actions depended on a line. Some ropes hauled yards up the mast, some pulled sails flat, some drew corners inward, some held the mast itself steady against the pressure of wind and sea. The ropes had different names, and experienced sailors knew them by touch and habit. A halyard lifted, a sheet controlled the corner of a sail, a stay helped support a mast, a shroud stood like a dark ladder at the side, carrying both strain and the feet of men climbing upward. To someone new on deck, it may have looked like confusion. To the crew, it was an ordered web. The ropes for ships had to be especially strong. They were made in long rope walks, often near ports, where there was room to lay out strands for great lengths. Hemp was valued because it was tough, flexible, and could take tar well. The tar mattered. Salt water, rain, and damp air were always working against the fiber. Untreated rope could rot, swell, stiffen, or weaken. Tarred rope smelled sharp and smoky, and it darkened the line, helping it endure life at sea. A ship might carry miles of rope, not as a luxury, as necessity. Spare rope was stored below because rope wore out. It chafed where it passed through blocks, it frayed where it rubbed against wood, it stiffened in cold weather and grew heavy when wet. A sailor might spend quiet hours serving a line with smaller cord, wrapping it carefully to protect the larger rope beneath. Repair was part of the work. There is something calm, almost meditative, in the thought of all those lines being handled by hand. A sailor takes the rope, feels its weight, braces his feet, and pulls with the others. The fibers tighten, the block creaks, the sail shifts a little against the sky. Nothing happens suddenly, everything depends on repeated effort, shared rhythm, and knowing which line to touch. And below all of it, beneath the voyage and the harbor and the wide dark water, there is still the rope walk, the long path, the hemp fibers, the twist laid into the strand, the patient craft that allowed a wooden ship to lean into the wind and move. In the countryside, rope was not a special thing. It was not kept only for ships or wells or large public works. It was part of the ordinary furniture of life. A coil of rope might hang from a peg in the barn, or lie in a corner near the door, or be looped over a beam where it could be reached without thinking. It was one of those tools that became almost invisible because it was needed so often. On a farm, rope helped with animals first of all. A cow could be led by a halter, a horse could be tied beside a trough, sheep could be held for shearing, a gate could be fastened shut with a short length of cord when the wooden latch was worn or broken. In places where iron hardware was expensive, a rope did the work quietly enough. It held, pulled, lifted, guided, and restrained. The ropes used for this were not always fine ropes. Many were rough, uneven, and made for use rather than appearance. A farmer might have hemp rope for heavier work, flax or tow cord for lighter tying, and old worn pieces cut down from larger ropes that had already served somewhere else. Nothing useful was wasted. A rope too weak for lifting a sack of grain might still tie a bundle of reeds. A frayed end might be whipped with thread, or knotted hard, or simply burned if the fiber allowed it. Harvest time made rope especially valuable. Sheaves of grain had to be bound. Loads of hay had to be tied to carts. Straw, brushwood, poles, tools, and sacks all needed holding together while they were carried from field to barn or from barn to market. Before wire, plastic twine, and machine-made straps, the rope was the flexible hand that kept a loose world from falling apart. In towns the same was true, only in a different rhythm. Ropes crossed courtyards for washing lines. They hung in workshops, warehouses, stables, and market stalls. Porters used them to secure barrels and crates. Builders used them to hoist baskets of mortar or bundles of lath. Bakers, brewers, dyers, and tanners all had their own small uses for cordage because every trade had something that needed to be pulled, tied, raised, bundled, or lowered. A rope maker in or near a town did not always make grand cables. Much of his living came from the ordinary lengths people bought again and again: cart ropes, clotheslines, lead ropes, bell ropes, packing cord, netting twine, lines for awnings, shutters, scaffolds, baskets, wells, pulleys, and handcarts. Some customers wanted strength, some wanted cheapness, some wanted a rope that would not rot too quickly in damp air. The rope maker had to know the difference, and so rope entered daily life not as an invention anyone stopped to admire, but as a quiet answer to hundreds of small problems. A bundle stayed together, a bucket rose, a door held shut in the wind, a cart reached town with its load. Before modern machines made fastening almost invisible, people lived in a world held together by knots. A rope by itself was useful, of course. It could pull, lift, drag, bind, and hang. But a rope became truly useful when someone knew how to end it, join it, loop it, tighten it, and release it again. That was the work of knots. Small arrangements of twisted fiber, learned by hand, remembered by touch, and repeated so often that they became almost automatic. A person who worked with rope did not think of a knot as decoration. It was a tool. A knot had a purpose, just as a hammer or a hook had a purpose. One knot made a fixed loop that would not slip. Another tightened under strain. Another could be undone after a heavy load had pulled against it all day. Another joined two lengths of rope when neither one was quite long enough. Each one answered a quiet, practical question. How do you tie a bucket to a well rope so it does not fall into the water? How do you secure a bundle of reeds on the back of a cart? How do you fasten a boat to a post when the tide is moving beneath it? How do you tie an animal so it is held safely but not cruelly? How do you lift a beam, close a sack, lash a fence rail, or draw a sail tight in wet wind? Before metal clips, nylon straps, ratchets, pulleys with locking teeth, and machine-made fittings, the answer was often the same. You used rope.
and you used the right knot. Learning knots was not usually a formal lesson. It happened beside wells, in barns, on riverbanks, in rope walks, on ships, in workshops, and at market stalls. A child watched an older hand pass one end of rope over the other, tuck it through, pull it snug, then loosen it again. At first it looked confusing. Then, after enough watching, the movement began to make sense. The fingers learned the path before the mind had words for it. Old rope had its own feel. Hemp rope was firm and slightly rough. Flax could be smoother. Tarred rope was dark, stiff, and sometimes sticky in warm weather. A dry rope made a faint rasp as it passed through the hand. A wet rope was heavier, darker, and less willing to move. These things mattered. A knot tied in new rope might behave differently from one tied in old rope. A knot tied in dry weather might tighten hard after rain. So people learned to judge not only the knot but the rope itself. There was patience in this knowledge. A good knot was pulled evenly. The turns were dressed into place, not left crossed and crooked. The loose end was given enough length. The strain was tested before anyone trusted it. In this way, a knot was a small act of care, quiet, practical, and almost unnoticed. And in the old world, before machines did so much fastening for us, that small care was everywhere.
There were certain smells that belonged to rope before modern machines made the work cleaner, faster, and more distant from the hand. Hemp had its own smell. Dry, greenish, dusty, a little like old hay stored in a loft. Flax was lighter and sharper. Coir from coconut husk carried something warmer and more fibrous, like the outside of a nut left in the sun. But in many rope walks, especially those making rope for ships, there was another smell over everything: tar. Not the hard black road tar we think of now, but a thick, dark, sticky material made from burning pine wood slowly and carefully, driving out its resin. Pine tar had a strong, smoky, medicinal scent. It clung to wood, cloth, hair, and skin. It got into the boards of the rope walk, into the aprons of the workers, into the fibers themselves. A person who worked with tarred rope probably carried that smell home at the end of the day. Tar was not added for romance. It was practical. Rope made from natural fiber was vulnerable to water. Hemp was strong, and for centuries it was one of the best materials available for heavy rope, but it was still a plant. If it stayed wet too long, it could rot. On a ship, this mattered greatly. Rigging was exposed to rain, spray, fog, salt water, and long damp nights at sea. A rope could not simply be brought indoors whenever the weather changed. It had to live outside under strain. So some ropes were tarred. The tar was warmed until it became easier to spread. Sometimes yarns were tarred before they were laid into rope. Sometimes the finished rope was drawn through warm tar, or brushed, or rubbed with it. The goal was not to make the rope dripping and heavy, but to work the tar into the surface enough to protect the fibers. The rope darkened. It became less pale, less dry-looking. It took on a brown-black sheen, with tiny sticky places that caught dust and grit. A tarred rope felt different in the hand. It could be stiff at first, especially in cold weather. It might creak a little when bent. It could stain the palm, but it resisted damp better than untreated fiber, and in the world before synthetic materials that made it valuable, sailors knew the feel of it. Dock workers knew it. Anyone who handled ship's rigging, mooring lines, or heavy outdoor cordage would have known that dark, resinous texture. In the rope walk, the smell would have mixed with many quieter smells: the dry fiber waiting in bundles, the dust shaken loose by combing and spinning, the sweat of walking backward again and again along the long, straight floor, the faint warmth of friction where strands twisted under tension, the damp smell of weather outside the open doors, and somewhere nearby the dark sweetness of tar, heavy and persistent. It is easy to think of old crafts only through the eye: the long rope walk, the turning wheel, the workers stepping slowly backward with fiber in their hands. But these places were also known. The rope walk was not only a place of fiber, hooks, wheels, and tar, it was also a place of people. Long before rope was made in factories, every yard of it depended on bodies moving in rhythm, hour after hour, along a narrow path. Some ropewalks were small, attached to a farm, a village workshop, or a town yard. Others were very long, especially in port cities where ships needed great quantities of line. A proper shipyard ropewalk could stretch for hundreds of feet, because the rope had to be made at nearly its finished length. The workers needed room to walk, to twist, to draw the strands out evenly, and to keep everything under control. The work was simple to describe, but not easy to do. One worker might stand at the wheel, turning it steadily so the hooks rotated at the right speed. Another walked backward with hemp around his waist or held in his hands, feeding out fiber as it twisted into yarn. Others watched the forming line, keeping it smooth, correcting loose places, making sure no lump or thin patch passed unnoticed. For heavier rope, several men might work together, each responsible for one strand, walking slowly away from the turning hooks as the fibers tightened behind them. It was work that required patience more than display. A good rope maker did not need to hurry. In fact, hurry could spoil the rope. Too much twist made it hard and lively, eager to kink. Too little twist left it weak. The workers learned to judge this with their hands and their eyes. They watched how the yarn curled when it was slack. They felt how it resisted when pulled. They knew the sound of a strand tightening properly, the faint creak and whisper of hemp settling into itself. The work was physical in a quiet, repeating way. There was walking, always walking, backward steps along packed earth or wooden boards, arms held steady, fingers roughened by fiber, shoulders used to the pull of forming line. In cold weather the hemp could feel stiff and dry, in damp weather it might drag and cling. Tarred rope brought another layer to the labor, coating hands and clothing with a smell that stayed long after the day was over. There were skilled workers, apprentices, boys, older men, and sometimes women preparing fiber or helping with lighter cordage. Like many old crafts, the ropewalk held several kinds of labor at once. Some of it was respected skill, some of it was ordinary hard work. Much of it was learned by watching, then trying, then being corrected until the hands began to understand what the mind could not yet explain. A finished rope could seem plain when coiled on the floor, but inside it were all those slow steps, the turning wheel, the backward walk, the careful feeding of fiber, the small corrections made before weakness became permanent. The workers of the ropewalk made strength by repetition, not in a single grand act but in hundreds of quiet motions laid together like the strands themselves. Before a rope was trusted with real work, it had to be judged. Not always by a written measurement, not always by a scale or a gauge or a machine that could pull until the rope gave way. In many older rope walks, the first test was simpler than that. A hand closed around the finished line, a thumb pressed into it. The rope was bent, rubbed, lifted, and listened to in the quiet way that workers listen to material they know well. A good rope had a certain life in it. It was firm but not dead. It yielded a little under the fingers, then came back. If it was too soft, the twist might be loose, and the fibers inside could shift against one another when put under strain. If it was too hard, it might have been over-twisted, making it stiff and brittle in use. The right rope lay somewhere between those two faults. It had body, it had spring. The rope maker could feel whether the strands were even. He ran the rope through his hands and noticed small changes, a thin place, a lump, a section where one yarn had taken more twist than the others. These things mattered. A rope often failed at its weakest part, not along its whole length. One poorly dressed stretch, one uneven join, one place where damp fiber had not been properly worked could decide whether a bucket came safely out of a well or whether a load slipped from a cart. Sometimes the test was made by pulling. Two men might take hold of a rope and lean back with their weight, or the rope might be looped around a post, a beam, or an iron hook and drawn tight. This was not always a formal test, it was a practical one. The rope was stretched, watched, and felt. Did it settle evenly? Did the strands bite together? Did it creak in the steady way of hemp tightening, or did it crackle in a way that suggested broken fibers inside? A rope maker learned these differences over time.
The hand became a kind of measuring instrument, so did the ear, so did the shoulder and the back. When a rope was pulled hard, it spoke through the body of the person holding it. A steady rope gave a steady resistance. An uncertain one shifted, jumped, or seemed to give too much at once. There were visual signs too. The lay of the rope, meaning the spiral of its strands, had to be regular. The angle of the twist should not suddenly change. Loose hairs of fiber were expected, especially in natural rope, but too much fuzz could mean weak dressing or poor material. Dark spots might show old dampness. Pale, dry places might show fiber that had been overexposed to sun or weather before it was ever made into rope. For larger ropes, especially those intended for ships, testing could become more deliberate. A rope might be strained with blocks and tackle, or loaded gradually, or compared against ropes of known quality, but even then the old knowledge did not disappear. Numbers could say one thing and the hand could say another. A rope that passed a pull.
A rope was not thrown away just because it had begun to wear. In a world where every useful length of cordage had taken time, land, labor, and skill to make, people learned to look at rope with patient eyes. A frayed end, a broken strand, a stiff place where tar and salt had gathered, a weak patch rubbed thin by a pulley. These were not always signs that the rope was finished. Often they were simply signs that it needed attention. The first repair was usually the simplest one. The end had to be stopped from unraveling. A cut rope wants to open itself. The twist that once held it neatly together begins to loosen, and the separate yarn spread like dry grass. So the end was whipped. A smaller cord was wrapped tightly around it, turn after turn, close and firm, binding the strands in place. The worker tucked the final end beneath the wraps and pulled it tight so the binding held without a knot sticking out. It was a small thing, but it mattered. A well-whipped rope end could pass through the hand cleanly, without shedding fiber every time it was used. If a rope had broken, or if a damaged section had to be cut away, the stronger repair was a splice. This was not the same as tying two ends together. A knot made a lump, and a lump could catch, jam, or weaken the line. A splice joined the rope back into itself. The worker opened the strands of one end with a marlin spike or a simple pointed tool, then tucked the loose strands of the other end under and over, following the lay of the rope. Each strand had to be worked in carefully, not too loose and not too tight. Done well, the splice became part of the rope's body. It was thicker than the rest, but smooth enough to pass over a drum or around a post. Old rope found many second lives. A long line no longer trusted for lifting a heavy bucket might be cut into shorter pieces for tying gates, bundling brushwood, hanging tools, or mending harness. On farms, scraps of rope were too useful to waste. In ports and shipyards, worn rope might become fenders, lashings, mats, or oakum, picked apart by hand into loose fiber and pushed into seams with tar to help keep water out. This picking apart was slow work. The rope had to be teased open, strand by strand, then yarn by yarn, until it was no longer a rope at all, but a rough mass of fiber again. It was work sometimes given to people with little strength left for heavier labor, but it still required patience. The fingers learned the old twist in reverse. What had once been made by turning fiber together was now unmade by pulling it apart. There is something gentle in this, in the way rope passed from one use to another. It began as plants in a field. It became fiber, then yarn, then rope. It lifted water, held sails, tied animals, secured loads, and steadied the ordinary movements of daily life. And when it weakened, it did not immediately disappear. It became smaller cords, padding, caulking, binding, scrap, and finally loose fiber again. Nothing in that older world was truly casual. A rope remembered the hands that made it, but it also gathered the mark. By the time machines began to enter the rope walk, the old craft had already been refined by many generations of hands. A rope maker before the age of engines did not work by guesswork. He knew the feel of good fiber. He knew how much twist a yarn could take before it became hard and wiry. He knew how a rope should sound when it was stretched, and how it should lie in a coil on the floor. Machines did not invent rope, they changed the pace of making it. At first the change was not always dramatic. Some rope walks kept the same long buildings, the same straight lanes, the same smell of hemp, tar, dust, and damp wood. but instead of one man turning a wheel by hand, a horse might turn a capstan. Later, water power, steam, and engines could drive the hooks more steadily. The twisting no longer depended on the tired arm of a worker at the end of the day. It could continue with a more even pull, hour after hour. This mattered because rope is a thing made from tension. Every part of it depends on balance. The small fibers must be drawn out and twisted into yarn. The yarns must be gathered and twisted into strands. The strands must be laid together in the opposite direction so the rope holds itself closed. If one part is tighter than another, the rope can kink. If one strand is weaker, the strain will find it. Machines helped make that balance more regular. They also made rope faster. A rope walk that once needed many workers walking backward, feeding fiber from their waists or aprons, could begin to use spinning frames and laying machines. Bobbins could carry prepared yarn. Gears could keep hooks moving together. Measuring devices could help control length and thickness. The old rhythm of footsteps did not disappear all at once, but it began to be joined by the rhythm of shafts, belts, wheels, and iron teeth. For the workers, this was not simply progress in a neat line. Some tasks became easier on the body, some skills were still needed but in different places. A man who once judged twist by hand might now watch the machine and correct it when it wandered. A woman or child who prepared fiber might now feed material into a frame. The knowledge did not vanish, but it moved from the fingers alone into the careful tending of equipment. Machines also changed the size of what could be made. Ships, mines, bridges, factories, and railways all wanted rope and cable in great quantities. The world was beginning to ask for more than a small rope walk could easily supply: longer lengths, more consistent thickness, stronger cordage, faster delivery. And yet, even inside the machine age, the old idea remained very simple. A rope was still many weak things persuaded to become one strong thing: fiber beside fiber, yarn beside yarn, strand beside strand. The machine could turn them more evenly and more quickly, but it still followed the ancient rule the hand rope maker had known all along. Strength came from twist, from patience, and from everything pulling together. At the end of a day in the old rope walk, there would often be one last coil on the floor. Not a grand thing, not a sail rope for a ship, or a heavy hawser meant to hold a vessel against a tide, just a finished length of rope, lying in a quiet circle on the boards or on the packed earth. After the workers had stepped away from it, the fibers had been dressed, the yarns had been spun, the strands had been twisted together, pulled against one another, tightened by hand and by simple turning gear. What had begun as a loose handful of hemp or flax had become a line strong enough to lift, bind, draw, fasten, pull, and hold. That is the simple miracle of rope. It is made from weakness arranged carefully. A single fiber breaks almost without effort. A wisp of hemp can be pulled apart between finger and thumb. Even a spun yarn by itself is not much, but twist gives it memory. Twist makes the fibers grip one another. Then more twist in the opposite direction gathers the yarns into strands and the strands into rope. Each part leans against the next. Each small weakness is shared, and because it is shared, it becomes strength. Before modern machines, this was not an abstract idea. People saw it happen under their hands. They felt the rough fiber catch on the skin. They watched the yarn tighten as the spinner walked backward. They heard the faint creak of the wheel and the soft scrape of the forming rope along the rope walk. They smelled hemp dust, warm tar, damp stone, oiled wood, old cordage, and the outdoor air moving through a long, narrow building. Rope was everywhere, and because it was everywhere, it often disappeared from notice. It hung beside wells, it crossed barns and lofts, it tied loads onto carts, it held gates closed and buckets suspended, it ran through pulleys, around posts, along docks, across ships, through farms, markets, workshops, bell towers, warehouses, and houses. It was one of those quiet materials that helped the world keep its shape. And when it wore out, it was not simply thrown away if there was still use left in it. A rope could be shortened, spliced, retarred, unlaid, picked apart, or used for some humbler duty. A rope that once served a ship might later bind a load. A rope that once lifted weight might become a tie in a shed. Even the frayed end had value if someone had the patience to see it.
The old rope walk is mostly gone now. The very long sheds have been replaced by factories or streets or nothing at all. Machines can spin and twist with a steadiness no hand can match, and they can do it quickly, endlessly, without walking backward one slow step at a time. But the principle is still the same. Fiber becomes yarn, yarn becomes strand, strand becomes rope. Small things are gathered, they are turned together, they hold. So imagine just for a moment that last coil resting on the floor after the work is done. It is quiet now, the wheel has stopped, the workers have gone home, dust settles in the length of the rope walk, evening light lies across